Chapter 68 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Annexation of Iceland and Greenland. After the completion of the colonization of Iceland, after a system of laws and government had been established and Christianity had been acknowledged to be the state religion, the throes of organization were over, and the people enjoyed a period of peaceful development, which may be said to have lasted from about 1000 till 1150. By the adoption of the laws of Oluf in 930, the new state received its constitution. The Althing and the Fjordungsthings were organized, and the local thing districts were limited to 12, each with 3 goder, except in the northern districts, or fjordung, where there were 4 thing districts, making in all 39 godord in Iceland. In 1004, a Supreme Court of Appeal, the Fimtardomar, was created in connection with the Althing to decide cases which could not be settled at the Fjordungsthings, and 12 new goder were created to sit in this tribunal. The Fimtardomar should consist of 9 goder from each of the 4 districts, fjordungar, and the 12 new goder, in all 48. But as the prosecution could discard 6 and the defense 6, only 36 rendered the decision. This new tribunal proved to be very beneficial. The resorting to duels, holmgang, in settling disputes had become very common, but after the creation of the Fimtardomar, duels were abolished in Iceland, 1006. In 1022, the relations between Iceland and the mother country were definitely established by the agreement known as the Institutions and Laws which St. Olaf gave the Icelanders. We have already seen that by this agreement a quasi-Norwegian citizenship, which indeed they had enjoyed since Harald Hårfagre's reign, was granted the Icelanders, i.e. the right of odel, the right to join the king's herd, to bring suits before the thing, to cut wood and timber, to inherit property, and to trade and traffic in Norway. In return for these privileges they had to pay a small tax, landøre, and of those who happened to stay in Norway in time of war, 2 of every 3 had to do military service. The intellectual, no less than the economic and commercial relations, tended to strengthen the bonds between the colony and the mother country. Every year ships from Iceland entered the harbors of Norway to carry back the wares needed at home, but still stronger were the ties knit by common religious and literary interests, a common language, and intimate intercourse in the fields of intellectual activity, which nursed strong the feeling that the people of the 2 countries were one nation. Christianity had been introduced in Iceland by Norwegian missionaries, sent by the Norwegian kings, and the 2 bishoprics in the island were joined to the archdiocese of Nidaros. In Iceland, saga literature and skaldic poetry flourished as nowhere else in the north, but most of the Icelandic skalds and sagamen stayed in Norway, where they found welcome, honor, and reward at the king's court. The Icelanders felt, as keenly as did any Norseman at home, that the king of Norway and his court were the center of Norse intellectual and national life, and the embodiment of the strength and unity of the Norse nation. Of this they have given ample proof in their songs and sagas about the kings of Norway. But the old love of freedom and local autonomy was also kept alive in the aristocratic Republic of Iceland, and their political independence was lost only after internecine strife had paralyzed law and government, and created unbearable conditions which had made a strong central government a paramount necessity. 2 principal defects in the political institutions of Iceland, the alienability of the godord, and the absence of a central government, led gradually to the disappearance of popular government and the destruction of law and order. The 39 goder of the minor thing districts were, besides the lovsigemand, the only officials in the Icelandic state. Their office, godord, was hereditary. They were the wealthiest and most influential and powerful men in their community, and usually kept a band of 40 to 60 armed followers. They had charge of the local administration, and were to maintain law and order in their communities. They sat in the Lagabøter, where they exercised all legislative power, and they also appointed the judges, who performed the judicial functions at the various things. The lagmand and the goder had to attend the Althing, and the bønder, farmers, who had a small amount of property, were also required to attend. It is clear that the goder, who had well nigh all the powers of government, were the pillars of the state. The more pernicious was the right which they possessed of alienating their office and of placing it in the hands of grasping and ambitious chieftains. Rival families gathered into their possession one godord after another, until a few powerful chieftains had usurped all political power, and ruled with sovereign power each in his own district. As no central government existed, their private feuds developed into a permanent state of civil war. They brought armies in the field and fought pitched battles. Houses were burned and property destroyed. The laws were a dead letter, since they could not be enforced. In 1217, a powerful family, the Otoverjer, in southern Iceland, felt themselves offended by the Norwegian merchants, and attacked and plundered some Norwegian merchant vessels. The Sturlungs sided with the merchants, and killed many of the Otoverjer. The news of these disturbances was brought to Norway by the great saga writer Snorre Sturluson, who had to promise King Haakon to use his influence to bring Iceland under Norwegian overlordship. He was made lendermand, and returned to Iceland, but he did not seem very eager to fulfill his promise, and as his countrymen resisted all attempts of that kind, nothing was accomplished. The struggle between the Icelandic chieftains continued. Snorre Sturluson's brother Sighvat Sturluson, and his son Sturla Sighvatsson, became very prominent in the century 1160 to 1262, which is also called the Sturlung period. Sturla forced Snorre and his son Urukja to leave Iceland, but his arrogance so angered the other chieftains that they combined against the Sturlungs, and defeated and killed both Sturla and his father in the Battle of Ørligstad in 1238. Snorre and his son had repaired to Norway to the court of Skule Jarl, and when they had heard that Sturla was dead, they made ready to return to Iceland. King Haakon had sent Snorre a message requesting him not to leave before he could make some arrangements with him regarding Iceland, but Snorre paid no heed and departed without seeing the king. After Skule Jarl's death, Haakon instructed the Icelandic chieftain Gissur Thorvaldsson to send Snorre to Norway or else to kill him. Gissur had been married to Snorre's daughter, but had parted from her, and he and his father-in-law were bitter enemies. He marched with an armed band to Snorre's home, Reykholt, in Borgarfjord, and killed the great saga writer, who was then 63 years old, 1241. Snorre was a great historian, but his contemporaries describe him as self-seeking and treacherous. When King Haakon found that he could accomplish nothing in Iceland by the aid of the chieftains, he decided to strengthen his influence in the island by the assistance of the clergy. The bishops of Iceland had hitherto been chosen by the clergy and the people, but as this was contrary to the canon law, Haakon got the right of election transferred to the Archbishop of Nidaros and the cathedral chapter. By 1238 Norwegian ecclesiastics had been made bishops in Iceland, and they naturally sought to strengthen the hold of Norway in the island. While the bloody feuds continued unabated, Haakon summoned two of the leading chieftains, Thord Kakala and Gissur Thorvaldsson, to Norway and retained them there for some time. In 1255 he sent one of his own men, Ivar Engelsson, to Iceland, who by the aid of Bishop Henrik of Holar succeeded in getting the people of the northern districts to submit to the king. In 1258 Haakon made Gissur Thorvaldsson jarl, and permitted him to return to Iceland after he had solemnly promised to bring the whole island into submission. Gissur did not act with much energy in the matter, and in 1261 the king sent Halvard Goldsko to Iceland. Through his efforts all the people of Iceland, save the eastern districts, were persuaded to take the oath of allegiance, and to acknowledge themselves subjects of the king of Norway. A compact was made between the king and the people of Iceland, stipulating what rights and privileges they were to enjoy. According to this compact they were to pay taxes to the king. They should keep their own laws, and they could not be summoned before a court outside of their own country. 6 ships should sail from Norway to Iceland every year. The Landora tax should be abolished, the Lovsigemand and the Sysselmanes should be Icelanders, and the island should be governed by a jarl appointed by the king. In 1264, the people of the eastern districts also tendered their submission to King Haakon. In 1261, Greenland had formally placed itself under the king of Norway. The Haakonsson saga says, "That fall Odd of Skjalta, Paul Magnusson, and Knarar Liv came from Greenland. They had been gone 4 winters. They said that the Greenlanders had resolved to pay the king taxes as well as fines for manslaughter, whether the person killed was a Norseman or a Greenlander, and whether the murder happened in the settlements or in Norðursetur, so that the king now received weregeld as far north as under the polar star. End of chapter 68. Chapter 69 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Haakon Haakonnsson's expedition to the Hebrides, the close of his reign. King Alexander II of Scotland had manifested great desire to gain possession of the Hebrides. He was even on the point of beginning a war for this purpose when he suddenly died in 1249. His son Alexander III was then a mere child, and a regency was appointed to rule during his minority. The kings of Man and the Hebrides were loyal to King Haakon, and for a time no danger seemed to threaten the colonial possessions. But when Alexander III became old enough to control the affairs of government, he revived his father's plan of joining the Hebrides to the Scotch kingdom. In 1261 he sent 2 envoys to Norway, as it appears for the purpose of persuading King Haakon to cede the islands, but the attempt was unsuccessful. In the summer of the following year news was brought to Norway that William Earl of Ross, together with many other Scotch chieftains, had attacked the island of Skye and harried it most cruelly, the report adding that it was King Alexander's intention to conquer all the isles. The attack was evidently made by his orders, since hostages were carried to Scotland, where they were kept in custody at the Iverness Castle at the expense of the government. This made Haakon very angry, and by the advice of his council he decided to declare war. In the spring of 1263 he began to make preparations for an expedition to Scotland. He committed the government at home to his son Magnus and collected a large fleet at Bergen. An advanced squadron of 8 vessels was dispatched to aid King Magnus Olafsson of Man, but because of stormy weather it did not reach its destination before the main fleet arrived on the coast of Scotland. On the 5th of July the king sailed from Bergen, accompanied by Magnus Jarl of the Orkneys, who had been called to Norway as it seems for the purpose of assisting in the undertaking. How large the fleet was is not definitely stated in the saga, which says that Haakon had over 120 ships when the whole fleet was assembled in the Hebrides. The old Scotch historian Fordun states that he had 160 ships and 20,000 men, which agrees quite well with the saga. This was probably the largest army ever sent from Norway to the British Isles, and great alarm spread through the coast districts of Scotland, where the attack might be expected at any time. Haakon sailed by way of the Shetland Islands to the Orkneys, where he stopped for a few days to work out a more detailed plan of campaign. He would divide his fleet into 2 squadrons, one which would go to Moray Firth and attack the eastern districts of Scotland, while the king himself would proceed to the Hebrides with the other. But his captains refused to go anywhere except under the king's direct command, and the plan had to be abandoned. While waiting for their forces from the Orkneys to complete their preparations, he went to Caithness, and compelled the people to pay tribute because they had accepted the overlordship of the King of Scotland. He offered them peace if they would pay a certain amount, probably of stores and provisions, and they promptly accepted the terms. King Alexander III strengthened the garrisons and defenses of the castles in all the districts where an attack might be expected. At Iverness on Moray Firth, at Ayr and Wigtoun in the southern part, and even at Stirling the garrisons were strengthened, and energetic measures were taken to collect ships and to build new ones. On the 10th of August Haakon left the Orkneys. The forces of these islands had not yet completed their armament, but they were ordered to follow as soon as they could. They sailed by the way of Lewis into the Sound of Skye, and came to anchor at the little island of Cailleachstone (Norse Kerlikorstein), where he was joined by the king of Man and the forces which had been dispatched to that island. When he entered the Sound of Mull, King Dugald of the Hebrides met him in a light craft, and piloted the fleet to Kerrera, where the forces from the islands had assembled to join the main fleet. Both King Magnus Olafsson of Man and King Dugald MacRory (Roedri) of the Hebrides were royal to King Haakon, but Eogan of Argyll, whom he had given the title of king and invested with the island of Mull, had joined Alexander III. Eogan had large fiefs on the mainland of Scotland, and as he found it impossible to serve 2 masters, he dropped his royal title, and with it his allegiance to King Haakon. From Kerrera, Haakon sent 50 ships in command to King Dugald, King Magnus, and some Norwegian ships to Cantir, and 15 ships to the castle of Rothesay, in the island of Bute. With the rest of the fleet he advanced to the island of Giga. The lords Murchad and Angus of Cantir came to Haakon to offer their submission, and took an oath of allegiance to him, but they had to pay a tribute of 1,200 head of cattle. The castle of Rothesay also capitulated without much resistance. Envoys now also came from Ireland to King Haakon, and offered the submission of the people of Ireland, if he would deliver them from the oppressive English rule. It is not stated who these envoys were, but it is quite clear that they came from the Norse colonies, who felt sorely oppressed under English rule. It has already been stated elsewhere that the English had taken their cities, and had forced the Norsemen to withdraw and found new settlements outside the city limits. Haakon sent Sigurd from the Hebrides to Ireland with some light vessels to investigate the conditions, while he moved his fleet around Cantir to the island of Aran. Haakon's large fleet, as well as the victories which they had already won, so alarmed King Alexander III that he sent messengers to sue for peace, and Haakon welcomed this opportunity to terminate the hostilities. The summer was nearly spent, and he foresaw the danger of exposing his fleet to the severe autumn storms in these dangerous waters. An armistice was arranged, but King Alexander would not accept the terms offered, and much time was wasted in fruitless negotiations. Finally, Haakon grew impatient and gave notice that he would renew the campaign. He had advanced up the Firth of Clyde, whence he sent 60 ships into Loch Long, while the main force was to land at Largs to fight the Scotch army stationed there. The forces sent to Loch Long brought the boats to Loch Lomond, and ravaged the country as far as Stirling, but on the 1st and 2nd of October a hurricane swept over western Scotland, and put a sudden end to further operations. 10 ships of the squadron in Loch Long foundered, and of the main fleet at Largs many ships were damaged or driven ashore. The king sought refuge in the island of Cymru, but many ships drifted to the mainland, where they were attacked by the Scots. When the storm abated somewhat, the king again went on board the ships, and sent aid to the men on shore. The Scots were driven off, and the Norse detachments spent the night on land. In the morning, October 2nd, the Scotch main army came up. About 1,000 Norsemen were now on shore, of whom 240 were stationed on a hillock. They were attacked by overwhelming numbers. Many fell, and the rest fled to the shore, where they made a spirited resistance. At last 2 captains succeeded in landing fresh troops, and the Scots were driven back upon the hill, and finally put to flight. The battle was over, and the Norsemen returned to their ships. The next morning they landed again, removed the dead from the battlefield, and buried them near a church, probably in the island of Bute. The squadron from Loch Long again joined the fleet, and Haakon destroyed his stranded ships, and moved his fleet to Lambash harbor. Sigurd of the Hebrides, who had been sent to Ireland, now returned with a message from the Irish people to the king that they would keep his army the whole winter if he would come and deliver them from the English. He called a thing to consider this proposal, but his men were opposed to it as it was late in the season, and they were short of provisions. He decided therefore to go into winter quarters in the Orkneys, and many of his men were permitted to return to Norway. After a very stormy voyage, he reached these islands during the last days of October. King Haakon, who was now 59 years old, seems to have overexerted himself in this strenuous naval campaign. Not long after his arrival in the Orkneys, sickness confined him to his bed. During his illness, says the saga, he had the Bible and Latin books read to him, but it soon seemed to fatigue him to catch the meaning of the words. He then let Norwegian books be read, day and night, first the sagas of the saints, and where there were no more of them, the sagas of the kings of Norway from Halfdan Svarte, one after the other. He died, deeply mourned by the whole nation, December 15, 1263, and was succeeded by his son Magnus Lagabøter. His body was brought to Bergen, and interred in the Christ Church by the side of his father and grandfather. The celebrated Battle of Largs was in reality only a skirmish, in which the Norwegians were victorious, but this great expedition, and the disaster which overtook it, seems to have brought the leading men to ponder the situation more carefully. They began to see how difficult it was to defend the Hebrides, lying snug to the shores of Scotland, when even vessels like Eogan of Argyll sided with the King of Scotland. Could Norway afford to keep a dependency like the Hebrides, when her whole naval force would have to be kept in constant service to defend it? King Magnus Lagabøter and his advisors were wise enough to see that such a cause would not only be futile, but ruinous, and steps were soon taken to conclude peace with Scotland. After negotiations had been carried on for some time, King Alexander agreed to buy Hebrides and Man. By the Treaty of Perth, signed July 2, 1266, Magnus transferred these islands to Scotland for the sum of 4,000 marks sterling, payable in 4 annual installments. Scotland also agreed to pay every year perpetually 100 marks to the Crown of Norway. A fine of 10,000 marks sterling was to be paid by the party who violated or did not fulfill the treaty. At the time when the treaty was concluded, King Magnus Olufsson of Man was already dead. This island was never formally united with Scotland, but was held by the kings of Scotland as a personal possession until it was finally transferred to the Crown of England. End of chapter 69. Chapter 70 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Literature and Culture in the Age of Haakon Haakonsson. The Old Norse poetic literature, i.e. the Elder Edda and the songs of the Skalds, flourished principally in the period from Harald Hårfagre until the middle of the 11th century. After Harald Hårfagre's time, the skaldic poesy began to decay. Many familiar names are indeed met with later, but they indicate no revival of the old art of poetry. The 3 great skalds of Haakon Haakonsson's own time, the historian Snorre Sturlason and his 2 nephews Sturla Thordsson and Olaf Fitteskald, possessed great ability as poets, but the vigor and spontaneity had gone out of their verse, and Snorre and Sturla are famous principally as historians and prose writers. Snorre wrote his younger Edda as a textbook for skalds with the intention, as it seems, of creating new interest in the noble old art. It is one of the most valuable works in Old Norse literature, but it failed to produce the result intended. The age of Norse poetry and song was fast drawing to a close. The chief interest now centered upon history and romance, and in the course of the 13th century the Old Norse prose literature reached its fullest development. It embraces works on the most varied subjects: history, biography, geography, legend, and romance, all known by the common name of saga, i.e. narrative, to which must also be added treatises on grammar, mythology, and poetry, codes of laws, and other miscellaneous works. The sagas are written in a style of noble simplicity and classic beauty. Rich in contents, fascinating in form and diction, they rank with the Eddic songs among the greatest achievements in the domain of literature. Few persons in our day adequately realize the extent of the early Icelandic literature or its richness, says Professor John Fiske. The poems, legends, and histories earlier than the date when Dante walked and mused in the streets of Florence survive for us now in some hundreds of works, for the most part of rare and absorbing interest. The Heimskringla, or Chronicle of Snorre Sturlason, written about 1215, should be about 1230, is one of the greatest history books in the world. The historical sagas may be divided into 3 great groups: the Icelandic family sagas, dealing with the history and biography of the great families in Iceland; the sagas about the kings of Norway; the sagas about the Norwegian colonies. This literature began to flourish both in Norway and Iceland towards the middle of the 12th century, and reached its zenith in Haakon Haakonsson's reign. The old Icelandic writer Are Frode (1148) has been called the father of Old Norse history writing. He wrote the Íslendingabók about 1134, and some scholars have held that he also began the Landnámabók, which was finished by later writers. About 1150 Eirik Bjørnsson wrote the Hrytjarstykki, a history of Harald Gille and his successors, which has been lost. In the latter part of the same century Odd Snorrason wrote the elder Olafssaga Tryggvasonar. Gunnlaug Leifsson wrote another saga by the same name, Karl Jonsson wrote the Sverris saga, and some unknown Icelander wrote the Bolgungasogur, or Saga of the Three Kings, Haakon Sverresson, Guttorm Sigurdsson, and Inga Bårdsson. In Norway, the monk Theodricus Monachus wrote a history of the kings of Norway, De Antiquitate Regum Norwegiensium, in the latter part of the 12th or the beginning of the 13th century, and about the same time an unknown Norwegian ecclesiastic, probably in the Orkneys, wrote the Historia Norwegiae, the Augrip af Norregs Konungasagum. The first attempt at a connected account of the kings of Norway in the Norse language was also written about this time, but only a fragment of this work has been preserved. From the close of the 12th century, the Latin language, which hitherto has been used occasionally, ceased to be employed in saga literature. The Old Norse classic prose had been developed, and the taste for history writing had been fully awakened. The Morkinskinna, a compilation of sagas about the Norwegian kings, was written by some unknown Icelandic author about 1220. A more critical work is the Fagerskinna, also by an unknown Icelandic author, from the period 1220 to 1230. It gives the connected history of the kings of Norway from Halfdan Svarta till 1177. On these earlier works Snorre Sturluson based his Heimskringla, the greatest work of the Icelandic historiographers, written about 1230. Snorre's history is supplemented by the works of his nephew Sturla Thordsson, the last original Icelandic historian. He wrote the Islandinga saga, which constitutes the nucleus of the great Sturlunga saga, or the history of Iceland during the Sturlung period, 1160 to 1262. Also the Landnámabók, one of the most important sources for our knowledge of Germanic life, religion, and jurisprudence. King Magnus Haakonsson became acquainted with Sturla Thordsson and urged him, while on a visit to Norway, to write the history of his father's reign, the Haakonsson saga, Haukonr saga, Haukonrssonar. This saga, which is based on letters and documents of the royal archives, is the most important source of the history of the Scandinavian North in the 13th century, and gives a vivid picture of Haakon Haakonsson's reign. Because of King Haakon's friendship with Emperor Frederick II and his relations to the Lübeckers and others, it is also of importance to the history of Germany. This saga seems to have been written shortly after 1263. On a second visit to Norway, Sturla was persuaded to write the history of Magnus Haakonsson's reign, the Magnus saga Haukonrssonar, but only a fragment of this saga remains. To the historical works written about the kings of Norway belongs also the historical Olaf saga Inshelga, from about 1250, while the legendary Olaf saga must be classified with the legendary and religious literature. Several later works like the Hulda, the Hrokenskina, the Golinskina, and the Erspenil bear no longer the marks of critical and original scholarship. The sagas which deal exclusively with the Norwegian colonies are the Færinga saga, found in the sagas of Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Saint in the Flateyjarbók. The original, which no longer exists, may have been written in Iceland about 1200 or a little later. The Orkney saga, also found in the Flateyjarbók, is thought to have been written before 1250. The saga of Eirik the Red, which deals with the history of the Norse colonies in Greenland and the discovery of the mainland of North America, is found in two manuscripts. The older from the 13th century, in the Hauksbók. The later dates from the 15th century. The Flateyjarbók is a great collection of sagas and short stories, Thatir, written in 1387 to 1395 by two Icelandic priests, Jon Thordsson and Magnus Thorhallsson. The compilers show little originality or critical ability. Still, the Flateyjarbók remains one of the most fruitful sources of our knowledge of Norwegian history and culture. Of special importance for the history of Iceland are the sagas dealing with the church history of the island, the Kristni saga, which treats of the introduction of Christianity and the early history of the church in Iceland, the Biskupasagur, and the Hungrvaka, which give the history of the bishops of Iceland. The Icelandic saga writers have also devoted some attention to the history of Denmark. The Jomsvikinga saga narrates the history of the Jomsvikings and the Jomsborg, and the Knitlinga saga contains the history of the Danish kingdom from 950 till 1202. Most of the Icelandic family sagas were written in the period 1200 to 1300. The more important are Egil's saga, Laxdøla saga, Gunnlaug saga, Øyrbygja saga, Fostbrødre saga, Ljósvetninga saga, Røykdøle saga, Vaupenfjordinga saga, Hardar saga, Viga Glum saga, Hunse Thore saga, Gisla saga Sursonar, Njál saga, Vatsdøle saga, Cormac saga, Kureti saga, Gullthore saga, Svarfdøle saga, Bjarnar saga Hitdølekappa, and Floamanna saga. A second main division of the Icelandic saga literature is formed by the large number of the mythological sagas dealing with the heroic traditions of the Scandinavian North, the Fornaldarsögur Norðurlanda. Among the best known of these are Völsunga saga, Frithjof saga, Örvar Odd saga, Hervarar saga, Ragnar saga Loðbrókar, and Hrolf saga. Another important part of the Icelandic prose literature are the numerous works of a religious character, such as collections of homilies and sagas or stories about the apostles and saints. In this extensive literature we find the sagas or stories of Virgin Mary, John the Baptist, the Heiligramanasögur, sagas of the saints, Postulasögur, or lives of the apostles, besides a long list of sagas about persons prominent in the New Testament, such as Peter and Paul, John and James, Simon and Jude, Martha and Mary Magdalene, Stephen, Pilate, and others. To this literature belongs also the Stjörn, a large work consisting of translations of the historical books and other portions of the Old Testament, together with commentaries. The greater portion of this Bible translation dates from about 1250. Aside from the Latin historical works already mentioned, the Norwegian sagamen devoted themselves almost exclusively to the writing of fiction, consisting largely of translations or elaborations into prose narratives of chivalric metrical romances introduced from England and the continent, especially from France. These have been called Fornsögur Suðurlanda. E. Sars says, "The Norwegian court seems to have given the first impulse to the activity which in the course of the 13th century transplanted many French chivalric romances and other foreign literary productions into the Norwegian tongue. About Tristan and Isolde's saga, one of the earliest chivalric romances in the Norse language, it is specifically stated in one of the manuscripts that it was written at the request of Haakon Haakonsson. The event seems to be true of the Elis saga, Event saga, and many other works translated from the French. King Haakon's relatives and successors, who like himself had been well educated, also seem to have been interested in this kind of literary activity, and to have acted as its patrons and promoters. According to an old source, the Barlum saga Ok Josafats is supposed to have been written by King Haakon Sverrisson, who seems however to have been confounded with Haakon the Younger, King Haakon Haakonsson's eldest son. From Norway, this literary activity of recasting foreign stories into narratives in the Norse tongue was also introduced into Iceland, but these stories did not become popular there, as the style was best suited to the tastes of knights and courtiers. The Icelanders usually based their narratives on Norwegian translations, not on the original text, and many of these sagas, such as Thidrek saga, the Karla Magnus saga, and others are therefore found in widely different Norwegian and Icelandic versions. One of the most important and interesting works in Old Norse literature is The King's Mirror, Old Norse Konungs Skuggjál, Latin Speculum Regale, written in the reign of Haakon Haakonsson about 1250 to 1260 by an anonymous Norwegian author who must have lived in Namdalen near Trøndelagen. This work occupies a unique position in Old Norse literature. It is a didactic philosophic treatise in the form of a dialogue between a father and his son, in which the author planned to describe the education, culture, and manners of the four classes of Norwegian society: merchants, courtiers, farmers, bønder, and clergy. The father gives this description so that the son may choose his calling with insight, and that he may know what he must learn in order to become successful and honored in his profession. Only 2 parts have been written, but even in its fragmentary form it gives the most vivid picture of medieval Norwegian society, especially of the upper classes, of any work in existence. It is worthy of note that the agricultural class, bønder, is treated not only as an independent and highly respected class, but as a separate estate equal in rank to the courtiers and the clergy. This was something quite unusual at this time, when the agricultural classes elsewhere in Europe had sunk into abject serfdom. It is equally worthy of attention that the merchants also formed a distinct class, no less highly regarded than the others. The father says to his son, "Though I have been more a king's man, i.e. a courtier, than a merchant, still I would find no fault if you would choose this profession, for it is now often chosen by the best men." That the agricultural and merchant classes should stand so high is quite remarkable, when we consider that even the third estate, the citizen of the larger cities, had gained but scant recognition elsewhere in Europe. The father goes on to outline to his son what he must study if he wishes to become a real merchant. He points out the necessity of avoiding drinking and gambling, of being upright, Christian-minded, well-dressed, polite, and cultured, as this constitutes the general basis for a successful career. He must also study the laws, especially the bjarkeyjarretter, or Norwegian municipal laws. He must know the manners and customs of every country where he travels, and if he wishes to be especially well qualified, he should study all languages, especially Latin and French, for they reach farthest, but neither must thou neglect thine own language. He advises his son also to get a thorough knowledge of the courses of the heavenly bodies, of the tides, and other natural phenomena of importance to navigation. He must become especially well versed also in arithmetic, which is indispensable to merchants. He instructs him how to equip his ships for the voyage, in what seasons of the year he should sail, and what rules he is to observe in doing business. He gives the young man very detailed and elaborate instruction in political and physical geography, in which branches he shows deep interest and remarkable knowledge. He discusses the ocean currents, the prevailing winds, the aurora borealis, the volcanoes, geysers, warm springs, and earthquakes in Iceland, and the glaciers and icebergs in Greenland. He gives a description of Ireland and Iceland, and discusses the climate and the conditions in Greenland with great minuteness and with considerable accuracy. He says to his son, "But since thou doest ask if the sun shines in Greenland, or whether it happens that there is fine weather as in other countries, then thou must know, forsooth, that there is fine sunshine, and that the climate there in the summer time may be called good. But there is great difference in the seasons, for the winter is almost a perpetual night, and summer almost a continuous day. But when the sun is highest, it is strong enough to give light, but it gives but little heat. Still it is so strong that where the ground is free from ice, it is warmed so much that it produces good and fragrant grass. Therefore people can easily inhabit the land where it is thawed up, but that is indeed only a small area." He describes the fishes and animals in the ocean near Iceland and Greenland, and discusses in detail the fauna of Greenland, the domestic animals of this country, its products, exports and imports, and the mode of life of the people. In the second part, in which he discusses the courtier class, he speaks of the manners and customs of the court, of the power of the king, of the nature and value of the government, and instructs his son in military science and the use of arms. If we compare this system of education with the established curriculum of the schools in other countries of Europe at that time, we are struck by its superiority over all school plans then existing. The schoolmen were yet confining instruction to their trivium and quadrivium, which embraced little more than Latin and scholastic dialects. Of geography there was none, excepting that might be incidentally mentioned as explanatory notes to Latin texts. The mother tongue was banished from the schools, as were all modern languages. Natural science was not taught. Natural science was very much neglected in the Middle Ages. With extraordinary credulity the people regarded the most incredible as true, and being prepossessed by a belief in invented phantasms and wonders, they did not see God's true wonders in creation, says Carl von Raumer. The author of The King's Mirror finds it necessary for the young man, the prospective merchant, who wishes to be well educated, to study not only Latin but French, and especially his own mother tongue, yes, all languages, which simply means as many languages as possible. He has to learn the laws of trade and commerce, he must study the courses of the heavenly bodies and the changing seasons, i.e. astronomy. He must learn practical navigation, and he must devote especial attention to the study of nature, climate, ocean currents, glaciers, icebergs, volcanoes, earthquakes, and animal life on sea and land. He must also study political geography, the customs and manners of all nations which he comes in contact with, their products, their imports and exports. Besides acquiring such training, both practical and theoretical, he should also be a Christian and cultured gentleman. This system of education is so modern in spirit and general purpose that with but a few modifications we might well accept it today without much hesitation. A little reflection and comparison make us feel the truth of the great scholar Sophus Bugge's statement that the King's Mirror was 5 centuries ahead of its time. Strong evidence indeed that no people in Europe were better educated than the Norwegians. The remarkable growth of Norse prose literature in the 13th century represents the culmination of a long literary development and cannot be directly attributed to the influence of the reign of Haakonsson. Still, the court of the King of Norway was in this period, as heretofore, the center of the intellectual life of the Norwegian people. It was the place where men of learning and ability met, where the impulses from abroad were most directly felt, and where many of the leading works were written. Carl Jonsson wrote the Sverre's Saga at King Sverre's court, and by his aid. Sturla Thordsson was persuaded by King Magnus Haakonsson, Lagabøter, to write the Haakonsson Saga at King Magnus's court, and by his assistance. The Volsunga Saga is thought to have been written at the court of Haakon Haakonsson for the entertainment of the king, and a part of the Stjorn was written at the request of King Haakon Magnusson, died 1319. It is certain also that Snorre Sturluson was encouraged, especially by Skule Jarl, to write the Younger Edda and the Heimskringla. King Haakon's peaceful and glorious reign and his lofty example proved a powerful stimulus. He was well educated and could read Latin as well as Norse. He was intensely interested in literature and art, anxious to further the intellectual development of his people, as he was careful to preserve the power and honor of his kingdom and the prosperity of the nation. The King of Norway was to the Norwegian people what King Arthur was to the Knights of the Round Table, the source of national unity and strength, by whose influence and power they felt themselves united into one nation. The king was the bond of union between the colonies and the mother country, and the source of national tradition and honor. This would alone explain the great influence which the king and his court exerted on the development of literature and culture and the growth of national spirit. King Haakon took great interest also in commerce and the development of cities. On the coast of Bohuslän he founded the city of Marstrand, probably because of the great herring fisheries along this coast. He improved the harbor of Agdenes at the entrance to the Trondheimsfjord, and constructed wharfs there. He also sought to protect Norwegian commerce by treaties with England and Lübeck. King Valdemar the Victorious and his successors had not been friendly to Norway, and when war broke out between Denmark and the German city of Lübeck, Norwegian shipping was injured by both parties. Haakon therefore seized the ships both of the Danes and of the Lübeckers in Norwegian harbors, a measure which proved so effective that the merchants of Lübeck sent John de Bardevik as ambassador to Bergen to apologize to King Haakon. The result was a commercial treaty between Norway and Lübeck, concluded October 6, 1250. Treaties of commerce were also signed with the King of England. Haakon devoted much attention to the improvement of the coast defenses. It seems to have been his plan to construct a system of fortresses which would safeguard all important harbors and protect the whole coast. He rebuilt the Sverreborg at Bergen, reconstructed the Sverreborg at Trondheim, erected a fortress at Ragnhildarholm, near Konghelle, and fortified Oslo and Tunsberg. The many churches, monasteries, hospitals, and other public buildings erected during this reign testify to Haakon's great interest in cities and city culture. At Bergen he erected the Haakons Hall, a large 2-story royal hall of stone, built in early English style. It stood completed in 1261, when the wedding of his son Magnus was celebrated there. In later centuries this fine piece of early Norwegian architecture suffered much through neglect, but it has been restored, and it remains one of the proudest old structures which adorns the city. The Haakon Haakonsson Saga gives the following account of his activity as a builder. He built a church in Tromsø and Christianized the whole parish belonging to it. Many Permians came to him, who had fled from the east because of the inroads of the Tartars. These he Christianized, and he permitted them to settle on the Malangerfjord. He built a church at Offerton, a redoubt and piers for wharfs at Agdenes. In Nidaros he built a hall in connection with the royal residence, as well as a chapel over against the royal hostelries. In Bergen he built the Apostle Church of Stone near the royal residence. He also built a St. Olaf's church and a monastery at his own expense. He improved the royal residence at Bergen by erecting 2 stone halls, and by surrounding it with a stone wall with castles above the portals. He built the St. Catherine Church at Sandbru, together with a hospital, and gave to it property yielding an income of 200 mánaðarmaður. In the castle at Bergen he rebuilt all the houses which had been destroyed by fire. He erected 2/3 of the surrounding stone wall with embrasures, and built the outer castle. The All Saints' Church at the upper end of the Våg, i.e. the fjord, was also built according to the king's advice, and he gave to it 100 mánaðarmaður during his illness. At Agvaldsnes he built a stone church, the 4th in size of all the parish churches in Norway. At Tunsberg he constructed a castellated stone wall around the mountain, and built the Gauta castle across the Danaklev. He built also the necessary houses on the mountain, erected a royal residence near the St. Lawrence Church, and built a hospital near the St. Olav's Church, to which he gave property yielding an income of 300 marks. He caused the channel at Skeljastein to be deepened, so that kugger, i.e. merchant ships, could now sail where ferry boats could scarcely float before. He built the Barefoot Brothers Church at Tunsberg, but moved it later to Dragsmark, where he erected a St. Mary's cloister and a stone church, to which he gave property yielding an income of 50 marks. In Oslo he built a castle on the Valkeberg, and moved the St. Nicholas Church thither. He also built the royal residence on the islands. On the Valdisholm he also built houses. At Konghella he erected a castle on the Ragnhildsholm. He built a royal dwelling in the city, and houses on Gulløen. He cleared the Eker Islands, and built houses and a wooden church there. He likewise founded Marstrand, and erected buildings in many islands in Viken. He erected a stone castle at Ringsaker on Lake Mjøsen, and built houses there. He built also a hall at Steig, and repaired the church which was nearly in ruins. He also built a hall at Hof in Breiden, and donated property to it, and at Tofte he built a hall and a chapel. He bought Lo in Oppdal and built dwelling houses, hall, and chapel there. In Hedmarken he erected halls at Husabø, in Skaun, and at Ringsaker, and he caused dwelling houses to be built at Vidheim in Øyer. He also constructed a stone wall around the Sverreborg at Stenbergene, and built houses there, since the Bagler had destroyed the castle. This catalogue of the great king's many achievements furnishes all necessary evidence of his remarkable energy, and proves how great was his solicitude for the intellectual development as well as for the social and economic welfare of the nation. The greatest architectural work of King Haakon's reign was the building of the nave of the Trondheim Cathedral. After the death of Archbishop Oystein in 1188, the work on the cathedral seems to have been discontinued. His successor, Archbishop Ærik Bjørnsson, engaged in a bitter controversy with King Sverre, and was forced to leave the country in 1190. Sverre charged him with keeping a large force of armed followers, as if he feared an attack upon himself or his church. That he thus spent the money which he should have used to keep workmen in the quarries carrying and cutting stone for the construction of the cathedral according to the original plan. Whether Erik's successors, Thore Gudmundsson (1206–1214) and Guttorm (1215–1224), continued the work is not known, but it was not resumed with vigor till in the time of Archbishop Sigurd Eindridesson (1231–1252). He began the erection of the nave, which seems to have been nearly completed in the time of Archbishop Jon (1268–1282). The nave, which like the chancel was built in the Gothic style, was the most ornate and imposing part of the great cathedral. According to the old writer Absalon Pedersen Beyer (1530–1574), the west front had a large gilt circular window cut in stone. Peter Clausen Friis (1545–1614), a priest in southern Norway, says of it, "But about that same cathedral, how it was built or how large it is, I can write nothing save what I have heard of others, namely that it is built in the form of a cross, of cut stones which are chiseled into all sorts of figures round about the whole church, both inside and outside, so that it is astonishing, and in the west front, which is gilt, large images of the 12 apostles are cut in stone and gilt, and there are numerous pillars of polished marble, both inside and outside in the church, both white and black and of different color, so smooth that one might think they had been cast. In the southern portal there are about 60 pillars ingeniously wrought, so that one can not well estimate what this single door has cost, not to mention the whole church. How the nave looked when completed it is difficult to determine, for it was scarcely finished when a series of accidents gradually reduced the proud edifice to a melancholy ruin. But the Norwegian people, who have always cherished piously the memories of their past history, have long since made its restoration a national cause. Since 1869 the work of rebuilding the great cathedral has been in progress under the leadership of the best architects and sculptors in the country. Large sums are contributed yearly to the cause by individuals and private organizations as well as by the state, and before many years have rolled by the old church will again lift its proud towers over the city of Trondheim. End of chapter 70. Chapter 71 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Magnus Haakonsson Lagabøter, a new system of jurisprudence. Magnus Haakonsson, generally called Magnus Lagabøter, the lawmender, was 25 years of age when his father, King Haakon, died in 1263. He had acted as regent during his father's absence, and as he had been crowned king in 2061 at the time of his wedding, he ascended the throne without proclamation or ceremony. He continued Haakon's peaceful policy, not only because wise statesmanship dictated such a course, but also because of his own inclination, since his interest was chiefly centered on lawmaking and judicial reforms. He labored earnestly to promote the welfare of his people, and devoted special attention to the reorganization of the judicial system which constitutes the chief feature of his reign. But he lacked his father's robust energy and self-confident grasp of international affairs. He found his kingdom a field sufficiently large for his ambition, and the maintenance of peace seems to have been his chief concern in his whole foreign policy. The peace with Scotland, resulting in the cession of the Hebrides by the Treaty of Perth in 1266, has already been mentioned. As soon as the war with Scotland was terminated, King Magnus began his legal reforms by publishing a revision of the Gulathingslov, which according to the Icelandska Annaler was accepted by the Gulathing in 1267. The following year the revision of the laws of the Eidsivathingslag and the Borgarthingslag was also completed. According to Konrad Maurer, the two codes of church laws, the younger Gulathings Kristenret and the younger Borgarthings Kristenret, are also to be ascribed to King Magnus's lawmaking activity during these early years of his reign. In the Frostathingslag, the king was permitted to revise the secular laws, but the church laws were left untouched because of the determined resistance of the arrogant prelate Jon Raude, Archbishop of Trondheim, who maintained that no secular authority had the right to legislate for the church. The papacy, which had finally vanquished the Hohenstaufen emperors, stood at this time at the very zenith of its power. Archbishop Jon had witnessed the conclusion of this struggle while on a journey to Rome to receive the archbishop's pall, and he returned deeply impressed with the glory of the Roman Church and the power of the Holy Father, eagerly bent on asserting the hierarchic principles in his archdiocese with the utmost vigor. In Norway, the state church principle had been maintained since the introduction of Christianity, with but a short interruption in the time of Magnus Erlingsson. The king, as the head of the church, had also legislated for it, with the advice and assistance of the bishops. In conformity with the principles everywhere urged by the Roman hierarchy at that time, Archbishop Jon denied the king's right to legislate for the church, and King Magnus, with characteristic weakness, yielded to the resolute prelate. In the negotiations between the two regarding the new lawmaking, it may have been the archbishop who first suggested that uniform codes of laws for the whole kingdom both civil and ecclesiastical, ought to be prepared, and it is possible that a compromise was reached, whereby the archbishop was suffered to prepare the code of church laws, though he received no formal authority to do so. The first fruit of this new system of legislating for the whole kingdom was a code of laws for Iceland, the Jarnsíða, which was sent to Iceland and accepted by the Althing in 1271. On March 29, 1272, Pope Gregory IX issued a circular letter in which he summoned a church council to meet May 1, 1274, and he also requested all the bishops to report to this council all irregularities within their dioceses. Archbishop Jon believed that many abuses existed in his archdiocese, and he undertook to remedy them in the code of church laws which he was preparing. By his advice, Bishop Arne of Skálholt wrote a similar code for Iceland, which was accepted at the Althing in 1275. Jon negotiated with King Magnus with regard to some points concerning which controversy was sure to arise. As a worthy successor of Archbishops Oystein and Eirik, he sought to make the church independent of the state, but Magnus nevertheless was quite manageable and conciliatory. At a council assembled in Bergen, 1273, a concordat was arranged in which the king yielded to the archbishop on nearly every point, modifying slightly only his most unreasonable demands. But because of these modifications, the pope would give only a conditional sanction. This action of the pope ruffled even the pliant and peace-loving Magnus, and he interpreted it to mean that he had refused to sanction the agreement. Another council was called at Tunsberg in 1277, where the concordat was subscribed to by both the king and the archbishop, without going to the trouble of asking for the pope's sanction. The archbishop's code of church laws may also have been accepted, though this is doubtful, but in his joy over the settlement of the difficulty, Magnus showered additional favors on the church. At the Council of Bergen, 1273, King Magnus published a new law regulating the succession to the throne. According to this law, which was later incorporated in the General Code, the throne might pass to 12 different heirs in due order of succession. The first 5 were the following. First, the king's oldest legitimate son. Second, the king's oldest legitimate grandson. Third, the king's oldest legitimate brother. Fourth, the king's oldest legitimate uncle, father's brother. Fifth, the king's oldest legitimate nephew, son of the king's brother. If none of these 12 heirs was found, then the one which was the nearest heir according to the general law of inheritance was to succeed, but always a man, not a woman. Magnus Lagabøter's code of laws for the Kingdom of Norway was based on the older codes, especially those of the Gulathingslag and the Frostathingslag, but it is not as well written as the old laws. It was accepted as the laws of the kingdom in 1274, in the 11th year of King Magnus's reign. This code marks a new epoch in the development of Norwegian jurisprudence. Although many of the laws are borrowed almost verbatim from the old codes, new principles of judicial procedure were introduced which were wholly unknown to early lawmakers. These new features represent a change in the views regarding the punishment of crime, brought about by the rapid social development after the close of the civil wars. The heathen conceptions had given place to Christian ideas. The old warlike aristocracy was disappearing, and in its place the yeoman class was increasing in numbers and social importance. This class was less able to maintain their rights by force. They trusted in the security which the laws could give, and welcomed every change in the codes which would render justice more easily accessible to the common man. It was no doubt the purpose of King Magnus to adjust the legal system of the kingdom to the changed social conditions, and the people seem to have been conscious from the start of the need and importance of his legal reforms. This is revealed also in the prologue to the new code, where the king says, "You know how the most discreet men of the Gulathingslag have said to us repeatedly that they have heard that we are engaged in revising the law books of the land with the advice of the best men, and they have asked us that their law book may be revised in the same way." In the old jurisprudence, crime was not regarded as a wrong against the state, but as an injury to the individual and the family to which he belonged. The peace was regarded as broken between the family of the offender and the family of the party injured, and a state of feud or private war existed until a settlement was agreed upon. But it was a private affair which concerned only the families and parties involved. The injury done could be compensated for by a fine which was agreed upon either by the parties themselves or by men selected by them for the purpose of giving an estimate. Only when the crime was of a more serious character, so that the offender would be outlawed or sentenced to pay a fine to the king, did the case have to be brought before the thing. Here both parties had to produce their own witnesses. The thing secured the observance of the necessary legal formalities and rendered the decision, but there was no prosecuting authority, and whether the injured party sought redress through vengeance, which was considered lawful, or through private settlement, or at the thing, it had to be done through his own initiative and at his own expense, which made justice costly and difficult to obtain. The Code of Magnus Lagabøter introduced great changes in the principles of Norwegian jurisprudence by altering fundamentally the conception of crime, as well as the method of punishing the criminal. It greatly reduced the opportunity of the aggrieved party to seek redress through personal vengeance. In case of murder, the criminal should be turned over to royal officials, who would cause him to be tried and sentenced by the thing. If guilty, he was declared an outlaw, and anyone might kill him. But the relatives of the person slain could not harm the slayer before he was tried and sentenced. The king had the power to pardon the offender, and the plaintiffs in the case would then have to be satisfied with a money payment. In case of other personal injuries, personal revenge was also forbidden. The injured party should complain to the royal officials, whose duty it should be to appoint judges to decide the case, and fix a date for the payment of the fine. If the fine was not paid, the plaintiffs might resort to revenge, but the punishment inflicted should be in proportion to the injury. Crime was no longer regarded as a private affair, but as a violation of the laws and an offense against the state, which should be punished by a fine paid to the king in addition to the fine paid to the party injured. These fines should be assessed by persons chosen by the royal officials, and not by the parties in the case. The public officers were given greatly increased powers of apprehending, detaining, and punishing criminals. The code also created a system of public prosecution, according to which the things might take the initiative in bringing the criminal to trial. It established the following principle. Every free-born man who is of age shall bring his own suit, but if he lacks the necessary knowledge or ability, the royal officials shall bring the suit in his behalf. The judges were not only to hear the witnesses and pronounce the decision, as heretofore, but they were instructed to examine carefully the motives of the person accused, and the circumstances in the case, whether the crime was committed without provocation, whether it was done in self-defense, or whether other extenuating circumstances existed. The code says, "For this purpose courts of law are instituted, that there the wrong and misdeeds are to be measured, and the decision should be rendered according to the circumstances of the case, as the thingmand and the leader of the court find the truth to be before God and according to their own conscience, and not as many a fool has hitherto answered, that they judged only according to the law." This new system of jurisprudence, which placed the administration of justice almost exclusively in the hands of the state, increased greatly also the power and dignity of the king. J.E. Sars says, "In the provincial laws, i.e. the Gulathingslov, the Frostathingslov, etc., he was still regarded as a semi-private person. His authority had the character of certain well-defined rights which once for all had been given to the royal family. A sort of private domain whose well-defined borders he could not overstep without coming into collision with the rest of society. The Code of Magnus Lagabøter, on the other hand, placed him as an exalted majesty above the people. It says that he has his authority from God, and from this theory it deduces a duty of obedience to him to which no fixed limits can be given. The code expresses this principle as follows: "The king has received from God authority in secular matters, but the bishop has received spiritual authority in spiritual matters. Because they are God's officials. Secondly, because all recognize that they can in no way dispense with them. Thirdly, that God himself deigns to call himself by their name. He is, indeed, in great danger before God, who does not with perfect love and reverence uphold them in the authority to which God has appointed them." Together with the conception that the king was divinely appointed followed also, as a natural corollary, the idea that he was the fountain of justice. The lagmænd, who were royal appointees, presided over the lagthings. Civil cases could either be brought before the Hebrides local thing, or it could be submitted to the lagmænd. From his decision an appeal could be taken to the lagthing, which could only lay the matter before the king. The Hebrides were assembled and presided over by the sysselmænd, who appointed the judges and executed the decrees of the court. In criminal cases in which the extreme penalty was inflicted, an appeal could be made to the king, who possessed the power of pardon. The change which was thus quietly brought about in the character both of the government and jurisprudence was probably greater than the people themselves realized. In pagan times the laws were regarded as springing from the gods themselves, hence they were considered as being permanent, almost unchangeable. In reality, the old laws were the embodiment of old customs and usages expressing the nation's sense of legal justice at an earlier stage of development. These customs had indeed been modified by earlier lawgivers, but their fundamental common law character still remained. The new code, though sanctioned and adopted by the people, regarded laws and justice as emanating from the king, whom the people owed loyalty and obedience, not only because he was the head of the state and occupied the throne by inherited right and with the people's sanction and consent, but because he was God's anointed and ruled by divine right. This view is most clearly expressed in the King's Mirror, written, as already stated, about 1250. The father says to his son, "Now the king, as thou saidst, ought to be wise, well-informed, and also upright, so that he fully understands that he is only God's servant, though he is so highly honored and elevated to such great dignity in God's service that all bow before him as before God himself, because all serve God and the holy name which he, the king, bears, but not his own person. It is therefore the very essence of royalty that all have great fear and awe before the king, so that no one is irreverent when they hear him mentioned. The king is appointed to watch over this holy house, i.e. the courts of law, and he is placed in the holy seat to guard God's holy decrees. He shall so judge between men in matters pertaining to the body that he may receive eternal salvation, and likewise all others who watch over the decrees which are justly rendered. In his hands God has placed the sword of punishment, with which he is to strike when it is necessary, as we said that King Solomon did when he subjected Job to the punishing sword, and many others with just punishment. This development of kingship was not due to a sudden innovation by Magnus Lagabøter. The idea was latent in the nationalism introduced into Norwegian political life by Harald Hårfagre and his successors, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Saint. Harald Hardrada and Olaf Kyrre had nursed it, but King Sverre's triumph over clergy and aristocracy, and his position as head of both church and state, brought it to full unfolding. In Haakon Haakonson's reign it was so fully established that he could proclaim it officially in his code without a word of protest being uttered. After publishing the general code, King Magnus also undertook to revise the Bjarkeyjarretter, or city laws, a work which was no less urgently demanded. In earlier days the towns and trading places, yet in their infancy, did not constitute independent communities, but belonged to the districts in which they were situated. Nidaros stood under the jurisdiction of the Frostathing, Bergen under the Gulathing, Oslo and Turnsberg under the Borgarthing. The growth of commerce and the development of town life necessitated special legislation for the regulation of the growing urban communities. The Bjarkeyjarretter gave them a character distinct from the rural districts to which they originally belonged, and may be regarded as their first distinct organization as cities. They received their own mote, corresponding to the thing of the rural districts, where matters pertaining to trade and to the public peace and order were decided. The mote consisted of all permanent residents, husfastermenn, all of whom enjoyed equal political rights. The cities also had their own courts of law, the sjaumannadomar, a tribunal of arbitration for settling legal disputes, and courts for trial of civil suits. But in matters of more general character they were still subject to the lagthings, the city courts being legal tribunals of secondary rank. The chief executive officer was the gjaldkeri, who acted as major and chief of police. This first development of city government took place, as it seems, in the 11th century, during the period of commercial progress in the peaceful reign of Olaf Kyrre. The new Code of Municipal Laws, which was published in 1277, was based on the old laws of Bergen, and seems to have been intended primarily for that city. Bergen was at that time the largest city in Norway, and one of the most important commercial centers on the shores of the North Sea. Its municipal government was highly developed, and might well serve as a model for the municipal laws for all the cities of the kingdom. One of the chief features introduced by the new code was the creation of a byråd, or city council of 12 members, which together with the lagmand and gjaldkeri had charge of the administrative affairs and acted as judges at the townmote. The cities received also their own lagthing and lagmand, i.e. their own superior courts of law, corresponding to the general lagthings, which hitherto had exercised jurisdiction also over the cities. The lagthings should consist of 12 members from each quarter or precinct, appointed by the gjaldkeri, and the sysselmand, a new city official who shared with the gjaldkeri the highest administrative authority. The power of the sysselmand was gradually increased until he became chairman of the council, and the most important official in the city. The liberties granted the cities by the code of Magnus Lagabøter made them wholly independent of the rural districts, and facilitated the development of city life and government. Even before this time the merchant class, or citizens of the larger towns, had been regarded as a separate fourth estate, distinct from the nobility, the yeomanry, bønder, and the clergy. The new municipal code of laws for the hird was also revised by King Magnus. Laws defining the rights and duties of hirdmænd had existed from very early times. Occasionally revisions had been undertaken to bring them into harmony with more advanced culture and increased refinement of courtly etiquette. Such revisions had been made especially by Olaf the Saint and Olaf Kyrre, and the old laws were finally collected in a single code, the Hirdscrow, which was again altered and enlarged by Magnus Lagabøter. In this revised edition we find first the law governing the succession to the throne as it had been changed and adopted in the reign of King Magnus. Then follow the laws dealing with the organization of the hird, and the duties and privileges of the various classes of hirdmænd. Next to the duke, or jarl, in dignity were the lendermænd, who were the king's advisors and could keep 40 armed followers, or huskarlar. Equal in rank with the lendermænd was the king's chancellor, who was keeper of the Great Seal and prepared all royal letters and documents. He was usually an ecclesiastic. Next to the chancellor in dignity was the stallare, who represented the king at the thing and acted as the leader of the hird. With these is classed also the merkismaður, or royal standard-bearer, and the skutilsveinar, or officers of the hird, who on special occasions waited at the king's table. To the skutilsveinar belonged also the drotseti and skenkjari, who had charge of the king's household. The different classes of the hird, hirdmænd, gestir, huskarlar, and kurtisveinar, have already been spoken of. In 1277 King Magnus gave his lendermænd the foreign title of barons. The skutilsveinar were called knights, and both classes were styled lords. This was not only a change of name, but marks the beginning of a new nobility, which appears later besides the king as the real rulers of the kingdom. Professor Aschehoug shows that the new nobility developed from the hird, which afforded the chieftain class the opportunity to win honor and promotion in the personal service of the king. But the real foundation for their power was their ownership of land. The system of leding, Old Norse leidvanger, was also changed. The people of the sea-coast districts had hitherto been required to supply the navy with arms and provisions, while in time of war they had to furnish armed men, and to render military service in proportion to the value of their land. But as the navy was now but seldom called into active service, the leding was changed into a general yearly tax of the same name, which corresponded to the visøre tax for the inland districts. An attempt was also made to strengthen the military forces of the kingdom. The sysselmænd were instructed to keep a certain number of armed men in each skibrede, or naval military district, and those who held benefices under the crown were required to furnish one warrior for every 3 marks income. But the standing army thus created was not very large. Many features of Magnus Lagabøter's reign are imperfectly known owing to the loss of one of the chief sources for this reign, namely the Magnus Haakonsson saga, of which only a fragment now remains. King Magnus's oldest son Oluf died in 1267. His remaining sons were Ærik, born in 1268, and Haakon, born in 1270. At a thing assembled at Bergen in 1273, the 5-year-old Ærik received the title of king, as heir apparent to the throne, while Haakon was given the rank of duke. This was, evidently, done to secure an undisturbed succession in conformity with the provisions of the law. End of chapter 71. Chapter 72 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The growth of trade and the origin of a distinct commercial policy. In Magnus Lagabøter's reign, Norwegian commerce reached the greatest volume and the highest development to which it ever attained before its revival in modern times. A definite public policy with regard to the regulation and promotion of commerce was now developed for the first time. Each city received a fixed territory within which it had a trade monopoly, as trading in the rural districts was gradually restricted, and trafficking with other cities was prohibited. With this centralization of trade in the cities followed also a regulation that only persons possessing a fixed amount of wealth could become merchants. This hastened the development of a well-organized and opulent merchant class. Commerce was carried on, not only with the Norwegian colonies, especially Iceland and Greenland, but also with England and Flanders, and other countries around the North Sea, as well as with Wisby and Gothland, and other commercial towns on the Baltic coast. The English custom rolls show that the merchants of Tunsberg, Oslo, Bergen, and Nidaros carried on a lucrative trade with England, and many families, especially in Bergen, seem to have subsisted exclusively on the traffic with the British Isles. About the year 1300, Lynn was one of the most important commercial towns in England, says Alexander Bugge. The oldest custom roll for this town covers a period from February 5th, 1303, till May 19th, 1304. In this period, there arrived in Lynn and neighboring smaller towns 235 foreign ships. These ships brought goods to the value of £2,036, 4 shillings, 9 pence. The Norwegian ships alone brought goods to the amount of £1,067, 386 shillings, 12 pence, or over one half of the total amount. In the year 1304 to 1305, according to the same source, goods were imported to the same towns to the value of £3,688, 12 shillings, 10 pence. Of this amount, the wares brought by Norwegian ships represented the sum of £834, 27 shillings. For the year following, 1305 to 1306, the figures are: goods imported, £2,798, 14 shillings, 2 pence. Norwegian goods, £913, 587 shillings. Other English documents show that the Norwegians carried on a lively trade with London, Boston, Yarmouth, Newcastle, and other towns on the east coast of England. The chief articles of export from Norway to England were timber, herring, dried codfish, furs, falcons, etc. The trade between Norway and England developed in the latter part of the 11th century after Oluf Kyrre had founded the city of Bergen, and this commerce, which was of great importance to both countries, continued to increase until it was destroyed by the Hanseatic League in the 14th century. The earliest English commercial treaties were concluded with Norway, and embassies were frequently sent to England by the kings of Norway to bring greetings and presents to the English king. An alliance was formed between King John of England and King Sverre, which seems to have been more than a mere treaty of commerce, since John sent 100 English engineers to aid Sverre in the siege of Tunsberg in 1201. In the early years of Haakon Haakonsson's reign, this treaty was renewed, and King Haakon and Skule Jarl sent many presents and friendly messages to the English king. In a letter to King Haakon, Henry III says, "We rejoice greatly, and will continue to rejoice, because our realms are so united that merchants from your kingdom may unhindered come to us, and ours likewise to your realm." The treaty seems to have been ratified in 1222. A very lively commerce was also carried on with Flanders and neighboring provinces, at this time the most densely populated districts in northern Europe. Ypres and Ghent were famous for their manufacture of fine cloth, and Bruges was one of the chief commercial cities of Europe, where merchants from all countries met. The traders from France, England, Spain, Italy, Lübeck, Hamburg, Norway, etc. did business here in separate streets which were wholly controlled by them. A report of the importation to Bruges for the year 1304 enumerates also the articles brought from Norway. From Norway come falcons, barrel staves, merins, butter, tallow, cod liver oil, or whale fat, ring, tanned hides, cuirbouly, and goatskins, of which Cordovan leather is made. Timber was also exported in ever larger quantities, especially to Friesland and Holland. From about 1300, it became one of the leading articles in the export trade of Norway. Norway's commercial relations with Gothland and the regions around the Baltic Sea date from very early times, when the trade in this quarter was carried on almost exclusively by the townsmen of Skiringssal and Tunsberg. At the close of the 11th century, Bergen became the chief seat of the trade with Gothland, and soon grew to rival Visby, the only great commercial city in the Baltic. It was especially the dried codfish which brought merchants from all lands to Bergen, and the Gothlanders, who had built up a great commerce, were among the first to profit by the trade with Norway. Danish crusaders, who visited Norway in 1191, say about Bergen, "Because of its wealth and power, it is the most important city in the land. It has a great number of inhabitants, and many monasteries and cloisters. There is such an abundance of dried codfish that it surpasses measure and number. There one can see a multitude of people who come from all quarters, Irish, Greenlanders, English, Germans, Danes, Swedes, and Gothlanders, and yet many more which it would be too difficult to enumerate. Matthew Paris states that there were 200 ships at one time in the Bergen harbor." It is evident that the trade with Gothland continued to flourish in the 13th and also in the 14th century, but no account of it has been preserved. In few countries did commerce ever play so important a part in the economic welfare of the people as in Norway, where even many of the necessaries of life had to be imported. Alexander Bugge says, "Norway imported especially grain. As our country has never been able to produce this necessary article in sufficient quantity, it has had to import it from abroad." This circumstance, together with the fact that Norway possessed a rich supply of raw materials, led the Norsemen to develop navigation and commerce in very early times. Grain was usually carried unground. Flour is not often mentioned in the custom rolls. Malt was also an important article of importation. Nearly all ships which sailed from England to Norway carried grain and malt. Of other imported articles may be mentioned especially cloth, more seldom costly fabrics, lead, spices, fancy articles, ale, beans, and honey. The chief articles of export were herring, codfish, timber and lumber, hides and furs, tallow, cod liver oil, etc. Commerce has not only been necessary for the prosperity of the Norwegian people, but it has always been a fair index to the health and vigor of their national life. When commerce flourished, it imparted new stimulus and roused the latent energies to the accomplishment of great things. Its decline was an indication of national weakness and decay. At this time, the Norwegian fleets of merchant ships spread their sails on all the seas, and crowded every important harbor in northern Europe. Prosperity had increased rapidly, and the great achievements in literature, art, and culture had not failed to create a reserved but self-conscious national pride. But a dangerous rival was already looming broadly into sight to the southward. This was a growing union of German merchants, which later developed into the Hanseatic League, a powerful organization with which the Norwegian merchant marine waged a long but losing contest. King Sverre seems to have hated the German merchants who visited Bergen in his day, probably as much through a general instinct as because they imported wine which increased drunkenness and corrupted public morals. The Sverre saga relates that the German merchants brought large quantities of wine to Bergen, that many people drank to excess, and that in a brawl many were killed or wounded. King Sverre then assembled a thing and addressed the townsfolk as follows: "We desire to thank the Englishmen who have brought hither linen or flax, wax or cauldrons. We desire next to make mention of those who have come from the Orkneys, Shetland, the Faroe Islands, or Iceland. All those who have brought here such things as make this land the richer, and we cannot do without. But there are Germans who have come here in great numbers, with large ships, intending to carry away butter and dried fish, of which the exportation much impoverishes the land, and they bring wine instead, which the people strive to purchase, both my men, townsmen, and merchants. From that purchase much evil and no good has arisen, for many have lost life through it, and some their limbs. Some carry marks of disfigurement to the end of their days. Others suffer disgrace, being wounded or beaten. Over-drinking is the cause. To those Southmen I feel much ill will for their voyage here, and if they would preserve their lives or property, let them depart hence. Their business has become harmful to us and to our realm." The king concludes his speech with a very eloquent plea for temperance. His animosity against the German merchants seems, however, to have had a deeper cause than the not very serious disturbance here mentioned. The keen-eyed king has probably discerned in the thrifty, able, and arrogant German merchants a dangerous rival to Norwegian commerce, whose business had become harmful to Norwegian commercial interests. We have seen that his grandson Haakon Haakonsson came into armed conflict with them, but that they sent an ambassador to Norway to make peace with the king, and a commercial treaty was concluded between Norway and Lubeck. From a letter written by King Haakon during the negotiations with Lubeck, it appears that the trade with the Norwegian cities had already become of great importance to Norway, and that the king was anxious to re-establish peace and friendly relations with them. He says, "You may be assured that we in our kingdom will not injure your citizens in their lawful rights, but that we will readily show you all proper favors, if you will keep the friendship with us inviolable. Send, therefore, in the summer, as usual, your ships to us with the goods which are necessary for our kingdom, namely grain and malt, and permit also our merchants to buy these articles as long as scarcity lasts in our realm." Owing to the growing importance of the German trade, King Magnus Lagabøter granted the merchants of Lubeck their first charter in Norway, July 18, 1278, in which he calls them his special friends. In August the following year, he granted the merchants of Bremen a similar charter. The privileges which they received were not very important. Magnus was a wise and careful man, says Alexander Bugge. He saw how dangerous it would be to grant the Germans too great liberties. Therefore the privileges which Lubeck and Bremen received were quite insignificant, barely enough to avoid making them his enemies. The initial step was, however, taken in granting special rights to these foreign merchants, who used every future opportunity to tighten their hold on Norwegian trade. Magnus Lagabøter considered Bergen his capital, and spent most of his time there. He maintained a luxurious court, and as he gave liberal donations to the church and to various religious institutions because of his great piety, he was often in great financial difficulties, and had to resort to the mischievous practice of debasing the coin to replenish his depleted treasury. But his love of peace, his kind and generous disposition made him very popular, and there was general mourning when he died on the 9th of May, 1280. End of chapter 72. Chapter 73 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1, by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Reign of Eirik Magnusson. King Magnus Lagabøter's son Eirik succeeded to the throne at the age of 11. As he was still too young to rule, a regency was formed consisting of his mother, Queen Ingebjorg, an able and talented lady, and a circle of influential nobles, who acted as her assistants. The most powerful of these were Bjarne Erlingsson, Gaute of Tolga, Bjarne Lodinsson, Halkel Øgmundsson, Jon Brynjolfsson, Andres Plitt, and the selfish and greedy Audun Hugleiksson Hestekorn, a sinister character, ambitious and unsympathetic, who, like an unlucky constellation, trails a deep shadow across the life and reign of the gentle King Eirik Magnusson. The queen and her assistants formed from the start a distinct party. They were the representatives of the aristocracy. They were bitterly opposed to the growing power of the clergy, and exercised great influence over the young king, who was docile almost to weakness. Eirik's younger and more gifted brother, Haakon, had been made duke before King Magnus died, and when the two brothers became old enough to rule, they seem to have exercised the royal power jointly, though Haakon acted alone in all affairs pertaining exclusively to his dukedom. King Eirik was to be crowned in the summer of 1280, but trouble at once arose between the clergy and the nobility as to the nature of the coronation oath which the king should be requested to take. The haughty and inflexible Archbishop Jon demanded that the liberties of the church should be duly acknowledged, especially the concessions which had been attained during the reign of Magnus Lagabøter. The queen and the nobles were opposed to this, but they finally yielded, and the coronation took place at Bergen on the 2nd of July. Archbishop Jon had hoped to secure a permanent ratification of the privileges claimed by the church, the chief of which were exemption from taxation and freedom from the authority of the secular courts, but he soon learned to his sorrow that the nobles were not disposed to be bound by their promises on this point. Instead of yielding to the archbishop, who would abate nothing of his high claims, the queen and her advisers requested him to submit to them a copy of the resolutions, or statutes, which had been recently adopted at a provincial church council, under the directions of the archbishop and the bishops. In this document the principles of the canon law regarding the independence of the church and the power of the clergy were set forth in the most uncompromising spirit, and as this had been adopted without consulting the king or his advisers, it gave great offense. A law was promulgated in the king's name for the purpose, as it was claimed, of amending the code of Magnus Lagabøter on certain points where it was not sufficiently explicit. But the new law made many important provisions, especially with regard to the lading tax involving the taxation of church property, by which the concordat, entered into by King Magnus and Archbishop Jon, was broken. No one could doubt that the aristocracy intended this as an open defiance to the archbishop's hierarchic policy. During the summer of 1281 preparations were made for the king's marriage to Margaret, daughter of Alexander III of Scotland. The Chronicon de Lanercost states that she was so beautiful that King Eirik could not rest before he had sent envoys to Scotland to ask for her hand in marriage. But as he was only in his 13th year, and never had seen the princess, he could scarcely be so deeply interested. It was no doubt a political marriage arranged by the nobles, who could perhaps figure out that some advantage might be gained through her marriage, as Margaret, in case her only brother should die before her, would fall heir to the throne of Scotland. The wedding was celebrated in the summer of 1281, and Margaret, who was about 20 years old, soon became very popular. She devoted herself to the care of her youthful husband, on whom she exercised a most beneficial influence. But unfortunately for him, she died in 1283 before he reached the age of mature manhood. After the royal wedding, the struggle between the barons and the clergy was renewed with increased bitterness. The archbishop seems to have demanded that the provisions in the new law which he deemed prejudicial to the interests of the church should be repealed. This request was promptly refused. The king's party refused also to accept the code of church laws which the archbishop had prepared, and repealed the privileges granted by Magnus Lagabøter in a letter of September 13, 1277. The cunning Audun Hugleiksson Hestekorn seems to have been the soul in this aggressive anti-church policy. He was related to the royal family, and the king called him his dear relative, Carus Consanguineus. While yet young, he came to court, where he rose rapidly through royal favor. Because of his ability and great legal learning, he became the king's stallare. He seems to have planned the whole campaign against Archbishop Jon, but he left its execution to others, and when the vengeance of the church fell upon those who were considered its special enemies, Audun Hugleiksson passed unscathed. The archbishop appealed to Pope Martinus IV, but the king's party also sent envoys to plead with the pope. The pontiff had heard of Norway as a great naval power, and as he was much taken up with European politics at the time, he gave the archbishop no support. This only added fuel to the fire. When Archbishop Arne of Stavanger refused to pay the lading tax, he was promptly outlawed. Archbishop Jon now resorted to the extreme measure of excommunicating the king, his mother, Queen Ingebjorg, and many of the leading members of the regency, but they answered by driving the archbishop and two of his staunchest supporters, Bishop Anders of Oslo and Bishop Thorfinn of Hamar, into exile. Their possessions were confiscated, and Jon Brynjolfsson was placed in charge of the archbishop's residence and the prebends of the cathedral of Trondheim. The archbishop fled to Sweden, where he died in December 1282. His body was not brought back to Trondheim for interment until the year following, when the excitement caused by the controversy had subsided. Bishops Anders and Thorfinn, who had repaired to Rome to prevail on Pope Martinus IV to intervene, received but slight satisfaction. After they had waited 2 years, the Pope finally wrote a letter to King Eirik, admonishing him in a friendly and fatherly tone to have due regard for the rights and liberties of the Holy Church, but no bull of excommunication was issued. Thorfinn left Rome before the pontiff had affixed his seal to this letter, and he died shortly afterwards in the monastery of Doest in Flanders. Bishop Anders returned to Norway, sought reconciliation with the king, and was again installed in his diocese. In 1287, Bishop Jorund of Heimar was finally chosen to succeed Jon as Archbishop of Trondheim. It is quite evident that King Eirik, who was a mere boy, took no part in this controversy. If he could have ruled, he would, undoubtedly, have continued his father's conciliatory policy. The epithet priest-hater, which has been attached to his name, is therefore wholly undeserved. The clergy was unable to offer further resistance, and the storm of controversy quickly subsided, as matters of graver importance began to attract general attention. Ever since Queen Ingebjorg had left Denmark in so unceremonious a way to marry Magnus Haakonsson of Norway, strained relations had existed between the two kingdoms. Ingebjorg had received no income from the large estates which were her rightful patrimony, and when she became regent for her son, King Eirik, she took steps to recover her possessions, which the King of Denmark would not surrender. It soon became evident that war could not long be averted, and the Danish king sought to gain the support of the merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg by granting them privileges in the province of Skåne. In Norway, the German merchants were growing more unpopular. The queen and her assistants endeavored to enforce the laws against them to the letter, and sought instead to strengthen the friendship with England and Scotland. The marriage of King Eirik to Margaret of Scotland was probably due to this policy, as new ties of friendship between the two kingdoms were thereby created. Before her death, Queen Margaret had given birth to a daughter, who was also christened Margaret, and when the only son of Alexander III died in 1284, this little princess became the nearest heir to the throne of Scotland. The Scotch magnates pledged themselves to acknowledge her as heir to Scotland, Man, and the Hebrides, and to defend her right to the crown. In the summer of 1284, the Regency sent an embassy to King Edward I of England to renew the treaty which had long existed between Norway and England. They were very cordially received, and Edward hoped to bring about a marriage between his son and the Norwegian princess. The King of Denmark, Erik Glipping, was opposed by a number of dissatisfied nobles at home, but he showed no disposition to grant the demands of Queen Ingebjorg. With her connivance, but unauthorized by the government, Oluf Erlingsson of Thornburg, one of the most powerful of the Norwegian barons, began a series of bold raids on the coast of Denmark. From his castle Isegram at the mouth of the Glommen River, he sallied forth into Kattegat and the Belts, where he took special pleasure in capturing or destroying German merchantmen. Great damage was done by the bold corsair, who is said even to have entered the enemy's ships in disguise, and to have bargained for the prize set on his own head. A number of leading German cities united, and sent a large fleet towards the coast of Norway to stop all Norwegian commerce. In a fight with the Germans, Alv at one time captured 9 ships, if we may trust the old folk song, but he was unable to cope with such large forces. The blockade almost isolated Norway commercially, and the government was forced to sue for peace. In the treaty concluded at Kalmar in 1285, Norway agreed to pay an indemnity of 6,000 marks of silver, and the merchants of the German cities in question should have the right to buy unhindered whatever they pleased and export it from Norway. The Norwegian merchants should enjoy the same right in the German cities. Norway was yet able to compete with the Germans, but these foreign merchants had gained a stronger foothold, and their presence proved soon injurious to Norwegian trade. Even after peace had been concluded with the Germans, the hostility with Denmark continued, and extensive preparations were made to renew the war with that kingdom. Queen Ingebjorg's favorite, Alv Erlingsson of Thornburg, Mindre Alv, a corruption of Milde Hrolf, who had plunged the country into war without authority, was not called to account for his strange conduct, but was instead created Jarl, and went to England as special envoy to King Edward I to secure his help in the war. Alexander III of Scotland died March 19, 1286, and Princess Margaret of Norway was to succeed to the throne, in conformity with the agreement of 1284. Edward I, who was anxious to bring about a marriage between Margaret and his son Edward, received Olaf Jarl very cordially, furnished him a war loan of 2,000 marks sterling, and granted permission to knights and others who were willing to go to Norway to help King Eirik in the war with Denmark. Olaf also tried, though without success, to raise military forces in Iceland. Soon after Olaf Jarl's return to Norway, the Danish king, Erik Glipping, was assassinated by his rebellious nobles, and the war was thereby averted for a time. Queen Ingebjorg did not live to carry out her plans. She died in March 1287. The impetuous Alv of Thornburg, who may have been her secret lover, and who owed his power and influence to her favor, immediately started a revolt in his customary desperate style. He burnt a part of the city of Oslo, but King Eirik, aided by his brother Duke Haakon, quickly quelled the uprising and banished the violent jarl. Hitherto, Queen Ingebjorg and her favorites had shaped to a large extent the policy of the government, especially as to its relations with foreign powers, though the king had been of age for some time. But the influence by which he had been dominated ceased at the queen's death, and he could now take the reins into his own hands. The hostile attitude towards Denmark was nevertheless continued also by King Eirik, and war broke out in 1289, but the only result of 2 successive campaigns was a further increase of the growing financial embarrassment of the government. In the second campaign, 1290, the banished Alv Erlingsson of Thornburg again found opportunity to renew his piratic raids, but he was captured by the Danes and put to death. King Eirik's attention was more and more absorbed by the question of his daughter Margaret's succession to the throne of Scotland, and the operations against Denmark were for a time discontinued. Edward I of England was making strenuous efforts to bring about a marriage between his son Edward and Margaret, as he hoped thereby to unite the crowns of Scotland and England. This may have been the reason why the Scotch magnates were no longer willing to abide by their former agreement to defend Margaret's title. Eirik sent an embassy to Edward I to solicit his aid in securing her recognition, and the king showed his goodwill by summoning a council at Salisbury, where the 3 Norwegian envoys met 4 Scotch and 4 English representatives to consider the matter. The Scotch representatives, the bishops of St. Andrews and Glasgow, Sir Robert Bruce the Elder, and Sir John Comyn, agreed to acknowledge Margaret as Queen of Scotland if she came to their country without having contracted any obligation as to marriage, a condition to which the Norwegian envoys agreed. In September or October 1290, the little 6-year-old princess, also called the Maid of Norway, was sent to Scotland, but she fell sick on the stormy voyage across the sea, and died shortly after reaching the Orkneys. Edward I now began to act the part of overlord of Scotland. He persuaded the Scotch pretenders, Robert Bruce the Elder, John Balliol, John Comyn, and others, to acknowledge him as the paramount lord of the kingdom, and to submit their claims to his decision. King Eirik also sent ambassadors to urge his claim to the vacant throne as Margaret's heir, but it soon became clear that the only candidates who would be seriously considered were Robert Bruce and John Balliol. Edward I decided in favour of the latter, who received the crown of Scotland as his vassal. The cordial relations between Norway and England ceased from that moment, and Eirik pursued a policy which brought him into ever closer relations with King Edward's enemies. In 1293 he married Isabella Bruce, granddaughter of Robert Bruce the Elder and sister of the later King Robert Bruce of Scotland. She bore him a daughter, Ingebjorg, but no son. It seems to have been Eirik's intention to strengthen again the bonds between Norway and Scotland by this marriage, but all closer relations between the 2 kingdoms now rapidly ceased. Among the common people of Scotland the tradition nevertheless continued to live that since the time of the Maid of Norway, the Norwegians claimed Scotland, and would someday return with an armed force and endeavour to take possession of the country. The Scotch poet Thomas of Ercheldoune, Thomas Rhymer, wrote a popular ditty about the Black Fleet of Norway which would enter the Firth of Forth. Not till it had left again could they build castles which would last. It will be seen upon a day between the Basson Bay, Craigen and Fitteray, the Black Fleet of Norway. When the Black Fleet is come and gone, then may they big their burg of lime and stain. Whilk they big it of straw and hay, that will stand till doomsday. The war with Denmark was renewed in 1293, and after some indecisive campaigns during the following 2 years, a truce was arranged at Hegnesgabel, according to which King Eirik and his brother Duke Haakon should have free use of the Danish estates belonging to their mother, Queen Ingebjorg, and merchants should be allowed to carry on trade unmolested between the two kingdoms. The truce expired in 1298, but it was renewed, and King Eirik did not continue his attacks on Denmark. It is impossible to discover any statesmanlike policy in this protracted quarrel with Denmark, as the advantages which could have been gained even under the most favorable circumstances would scarcely have compensated for the heavy war expenses and the losses incurred by the interruption of commerce. The indemnity to be paid the German merchants for the damages done by Ulf Erlingsson of Thornburg and the outlay incident to the war brought King Eirik into most serious financial difficulties. He was unable to pay the indemnity when it fell due, and the Germans used the opportunity to obtain new privileges in Norway. These were secured to them by a charter of 1294. In 1295, while Edward I of England was at war with France, King Eirik sent Audun Hugleiksson Hestekorn as plenipotentiary to France for the purpose, as it seems, of obtaining a loan. Audun had risen to great power after King Ingebjorg's death. He was the king's favorite, as Alf of Thornburg had been the queen's. He had received the title of Jarl and held the important office of Fehirðr, or royal treasurer. There can be no doubt that this powerful and unscrupulous baron exercised great influence over the manageable King Eirik, who had learned only too well to submit to those who possessed a will stronger than his own. Audun concluded with France a most remarkable treaty. In consideration of a yearly subsidy of £30,000, he engaged for the kingdom of Norway to furnish for the war with England 200 galleys and 100 large ships, with arms and provisions for 4 months of the year, together with 50,000 warriors. He well knew that this was far in excess of Norway's entire military force at this time, and that he contracted for his country obligations which it could not fulfill, but he accomplished his purpose of obtaining money, as the sum of 6,000 marks sterling was paid to him immediately. The second part of his mission was to obtain for Duke Haakon the hand of Countess Isabella of Jogni. This request was also granted, but the marriage was never solemnized. Audun returned to Norway about Christmas time, and the king ratified the treaty in March 1296. If he knew the character of the document when he signed it, and if he acted of his own free will, which is very doubtful, it shows what kind of influence Audun exercised over him. In 1297 to 1298, Eirik was able to pay the indemnity due the German cities, and it must be inferred that he used the money obtained from France to liquidate this debt. Fortunately, the war between France and England stopped, and Norway was never called upon to meet the obligations created by Audun's perfidious bargain. Audun's later career is wrapped in mystery. In 1299 he was imprisoned. 3 years later, in the reign of Haakon Magnusson, he was condemned to death and executed, and all his possessions were confiscated. This extreme penalty could be inflicted only for the greatest crime, and although nothing is known as to the nature of his offense, it has been thought that he was convicted of high treason. About 1287, Duke Haakon built the castle of Akershus at Oslo. The exact time of its erection cannot be determined, but it is known to have existed at 1300. The building of this castle seems to have been a part of a general plan to enlarge and beautify the city of Oslo. The strategic importance of this town had been repeatedly demonstrated. Its beautiful location, its fine harbor, and its proximity to Denmark, Sweden, and the Baltic Sea would also ensure its growth as a commercial center. It shows considerable foresight on the part of the young duke when he selected this town for his future capital. King Ærik Magnusson died in Bergen on the 13th of June 1299, 31 years of age. He had always been sickly, and through a fall from his horse he received in his boyhood severe injuries which further impaired his delicate system. Both physically and intellectually he seems to have been quite insignificant, and though he bore the title of king during the long period of 26 years, the helm of state had been controlled by other hands throughout the greater part of his reign. His queen, Isabella Bruce, who at the time of his death was a young woman of 20, spent her long widowhood quietly at Bergen, where she died about 60 years later. End of chapter 73. Chapter 74 of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Haakon Magnusson the Elder, The Change of Norway's Foreign Policy. King Eirik Magnusson had no sons, and his brother, Duke Haakon, succeeded him on the throne. Haakon was not in Bergen when the king died, as his marriage to Euphemia, daughter of Gunther of Arnstein, Count of Rupen, had just been celebrated at Oslo, but when he received the news, he hastened to Bergen, where he was proclaimed king, August 10, 1299. Later in the fall, he and his queen were both crowned in his residence city of Oslo. Haakon Magnusson the Elder, or Haakon V, was 29 years of age when he became king. He had been well educated according to the standards of the times. He could speak and write both Latin and French, and both in appearance and ability he formed a contrast to his weak and sickly brother. The Icelanders called him Hauleg, long legs, which indicates that he was tall and well built. His determination to rule according to his own ideas, to make the king's power absolute, and to weaken the power and influence of the aristocracy, proves that he was a man of great energy and willpower. But he was rather harsh and autocratic, something of a pedant, and he seems to have lacked the intuitive foresight of a great statesman. His reign, says Alexander Bugge, is a turning point in the history of Norway. With him the older period closes, and a new period begins, not only in the external history, but also in the development of spiritual and material life in Norway. Haakon was the last male member of the royal family, as all sidelines had become extinct. During his brother's reign he had seen the barons exercise an influence in the government which he viewed with deep regret, and in the neighboring kingdoms, Denmark and Sweden, the nobles had formed a strong oligarchy. He feared nothing so much as the recurrence of the conditions which had obtained in the time of Eirik. The establishing of a regency, or the election of a king, if the royal family became extinct, might endanger the stability of the throne. It became his great care, therefore, to secure the succession to the royal family, but this problem became very difficult, as the only child born to him in wedlock was a daughter, Ingebjorg. But neither Ingebjorg nor his illegitimate daughter Agnes, who was a few years older, could inherit the throne. If Ingebjorg had a legitimate son, he would stand in order of succession, but Ingebjorg herself was excluded, as well as Agnes and her children. Haakon succeeded, finally, in bringing about a change in the law of succession, by which Ingebjorg herself and her children, and also the legitimate sons of Agnes, could succeed to the throne. In case a regency had to be created, it should consist of 12 members, whose duties and powers were strictly determined, and the king should not be of age until he was 20 years old. Although the question of succession had been settled, the possibility of a regency had not been eliminated. He feared the lendermænd, whose rank and titles had now become almost hereditary. In case of a regency they might again gain the ascendancy, he thought. In order to prevent this, he determined to abolish the titles of jarl and lendermænd, and to retain only that of knight. Thereby the old hereditary aristocracy would be destroyed, and the knights, who received their titles from the king, would become personally attached to him. This plan was carried out by a royal decree issued in 1308, but the provision was made that the lendermænd then living should retain their title and dignity during their lifetime. He also organized the priests of the royal chapels into a distinct clergy, which should stand under the direct supervision of the king. P.A. Munch observes that Haakon Magnusson was manifestly emulating King Philip the Fair of France, who at this time was engaged in humbling the clergy and the aristocracy, and in making the royal power supreme. Haakon waged no great wars, but the hostile entanglements with Denmark were continued, and to these were also added serious troubles with Sweden, growing out of the closer relations established with that kingdom through the marriage of King Haakon's daughters to Swedish dukes. Aside from the humdrum of these petty wars, carried on at intervals with the neighboring states, in which no clearly defined policy of statesmanship is visible, Haakon's reign was uneventful enough. But in his time, as well as in the days of his brother Eirik, Norway's whole foreign policy underwent a complete change, which was fraught with the gravest consequences to the country's future history. Norway had hitherto maintained the closest relations with the British Isles. New intellectual impulses had been carried over the waves from the west ever since the Viking expeditions began. Great trade centers, like Dublin and Bristol, had been developed by the Norsemen, and the British Isles had formed the pivot of their commercial activity. When England developed her own commerce, her merchants established a lucrative trade with Norway, and the friendly relations always maintained between the two countries prove the importance of this traffic to both peoples. The Norwegians had hitherto been a seafaring and commercial nation. Norway had maintained an insular policy, and had taken no direct part in continental affairs. But Eirik Magnusson and Haakon V severed the bonds which for centuries had existed between Norway and England, and plunged their country into continental wars and political intrigues. Henceforth the Norwegians ceased to be a maritime nation, and Norway became politically a part of the continent. Personally, the kings, no doubt, had the best intentions, and were guided by the most upright motives, but they ruled in a critical period, and had to deal with problems which would have put more sagacious statesmen to a severe test. We have seen that when Eirik's daughter, the Maid of Norway, died, Edward I established his overlordship over Scotland. But Eirik, who had hitherto been his friend, married Isabella Bruce, and allied himself thereby with the Scotch. Through the treaty negotiated by Audun Hugleiksson, he had also entered into alliance with France. This agreement with France proved to be void of significance, but Eirik had identified himself with Edward's enemies at a moment when England was about to begin her long wars with France and Scotland, and when she was strong enough to wage a successful combat with both of them combined. The English pursued their trade with Norway very energetically, but they had found dangerous rivals in the German merchants, who had already received important charters and privileges in Norway. The English merchants, conscious of their strength, demanded similar rights, but King Haakon would grant no such concessions. They regarded this attitude of the king as evidence of partiality and ill will, and began to act with great arrogance. Many outrages were committed which aroused the bitterest resentment among the Norwegians, who made not a few reprisals on English shipping. As long as Edward I lived, no serious clashes occurred, but when the incompetent Edward II ascended the throne, the situation grew serious. In 1312, English fishermen on the coast of Bohuslän killed the royal sysselmand and 10 others. In Bergen it seems that the sysselmand Botolf arrested some English merchants and confiscated their goods, but they resisted to the utmost, and some of the king's men were killed. Exaggerated reports of these disturbances reached England. In a letter to King Haakon, Edward II complains that 400 Englishmen had been imprisoned, and that goods worth £6,000 had been confiscated. Haakon answered that he had not imprisoned King Edward's subjects, but that he had permitted them to stay with their friends, and that he had now allowed all, with the exception of 6, to return to England. While the estrangement between Norway and England was growing, Haakon was strengthening the ties of friendship with Scotland. He was still at war with Denmark, at times also with Sweden, and prudence would naturally lead him to welcome every opportunity to establish amicable relations with other powers. Robert Bruce of Scotland, who was waging his heroic fight against England, studied carefully the political situation, and made advances to win Haakon to his side. It is possible that he was aided in this attempt by his sister Isabella, the widow of King Eirik, who was still living quietly at Bergen. The yearly sum which by the Treaty of Perth Scotland had engaged to pay Norway in return for the cession of the Hebrides had not been paid since Edward I established his overlordship over Scotland. This also added to Haakon's displeasure with England, and we may suppose that Bruce offered to carry out the provisions of the treaty if Haakon would recognize him as King of Scotland. Haakon finally decided to act. In 1312 he accepted Bruce's invitation to send envoys to Scotland, and on the 29th of October the Treaty of Perth was renewed at Inverness, and most cordial relations were established between the two kingdoms. This did not mend the already strained relations with England, but Edward II was a weak king, and the important trade relations existing between the two countries contributed to the maintaining of peace. Over against the German merchants Haakon acted with more energy than his weak predecessor. In 1315 he enforced the already existing rule that only those who imported malt, flour, and grain to Norway should be allowed to export from the kingdom fish and butter. The year following he imposed a high export duty on articles bought and shipped from the country. If anyone failed to pay the duty, his ship and goods should be seized. No foreign merchants were allowed to remain in Bergen, Oslo, or Tunsberg longer than the term fixed by law. But the king's quarrel with England proved advantageous to the Germans. With the falling off of English trade, their traffic became of ever greater importance to Norway. In the early part of his reign, Haakon had been forced by circumstances to treat them with great leniency, and he soon found it necessary to modify the measures by which he had hoped to keep their traffic under control. But to the English merchants he would make no concessions. Haakon had chosen between the German merchants and the English people. Time proved that he had chosen most unwisely. He had estranged the nation with which Norway had hitherto maintained the closest and most profitable relations. He had granted favors and concessions to the country's most dangerous enemy, which before the middle of the century destroyed Norway's commerce and power at sea. And his affiliation with Scotland proved as valueless as that with France. The war with Denmark, which had lasted about 20 years, was still continued. Haakon was supported by the exiled slayers of King Ærik Glipping and their adherents in Denmark. The exiles held the castles Hunehals and Varberg on the coast of Holland, and the stronghold of Hjelm, built by their leader Mark Stig Andersson in the island of Hjelm, near the coast of Jutland. Haakon made repeated expeditions to Denmark, but no important battles were fought. The Danish king Erik Menved could not resist the Norwegian fleet, and Haakon seems to have made these hostile visits mainly for the purpose of enforcing his claims. In his anxiety to preserve the royal family from extinction, one of Haakon's great cares was to find suitable husbands for his daughters. In 1302 Princess Ingebjorg was betrothed to the dashing knight-errant Duke Eirik, son of King Magnus Ladulas, and brother of King Birger Magnusson of Sweden, while she was a mere child. Duke Eirik visited Oslo, where he spent Christmas, and Queen Euphemia, who found her chief pastime in reading chivalric romances, became quite infatuated with the brilliant duke, in whom she discovered all the knightly qualities of King Arthur's famous Knights of the Round Table. Her fondest wish was to see her daughter finally united in marriage with this personified ideal of her dreams. King Haakon does not seem to have been without some suspicion as to his prospective son-in-law's qualities of character, but in 1304 he granted him the important Konghelle as a fief. Duke Eirik was very ambitious, and he felt in no way restrained by any spirit of loyalty. He planned to make himself ruler of all the Scandinavian kingdoms, and Konghelle would form a convenient center for his operations. By marrying Ingebjorg, he would secure the throne of Norway. He would drive his brother, King Birger, from the throne of Sweden, and later he might conquer Denmark. He won his brother, Duke Valdemar, to his side, and the two soon began to quarrel with King Birger, who was less able, and also less popular, than his more brilliant brother Eirik. They sought aid in Norway, and described the trouble in such a way to Haakon as to gain, for a time, his sympathy and support. But things soon took a turn which he had not expected. In 1306 the dukes treacherously captured King Birger, threw him into prison, and made themselves masters of the kingdom of Sweden. They formed a secret compact also with Duke Christopher of Denmark, a brother of King Erik Menved, who was to rebel against his brother and drive him from his throne, and Duke Eirik promised to give Konghelle to the traitorous duke, although this fief did not belong to him, but to King Haakon. Eirik also sought secretly to create a party in Norway which would favor him, and he attempted to stir up the Norwegian barons against King Haakon. These events led to a complete rupture between the king and his prospective son-in-law. Haakon demanded that Eirik should return to him the fief of Konghelle, but he refused, and war broke out between Sweden and Norway, 1308. King Haakon laid siege to Konghelle and constructed over against this stronghold a wooden castle, Bohus, the beginning of the later fortress of Bohus, but after some weeks he marched away without having captured the place. He now concluded peace with Denmark and entered into alliance with King Erik Menved. King Birger of Sweden, who had escaped from prison, had sought refuge in Denmark. Was to be restored to his throne, and Princess Ingebjorg was promised in marriage to his son Magnus. Duke Eirik invaded Norway and captured Oslo, but he could not take the castle of Akershus. He also attacked Jämtland, and defeated a part of Haakon's fleet at Kalfsund, at the mouth of the Gota River, where it had sought refuge in a storm. But the next year, 1309, the dukes found themselves in a most dangerous situation. King Eirik Menved invaded southern Sweden with a large army, and Haakon captured Konghelle. If the two kings had cooperated properly, the dukes would, no doubt, have been defeated, but Haakon paused, and undertook nothing further. Duke Eirik had a powerful ally in Queen Euphemia, who probably used her influence to save her favorite. The Danes could not take the castle of Nykoping, and when winter approached they withdrew and returned home. Haakon also withdrew from Konghelle, and this stronghold again fell into Duke Eirik's hands. In 1310 the dukes concluded peace with King Haakon, and agreed to cede to him Konghelle, Hunehals, Varberg, and the northern part of Halland. King Haakon again agreed to receive his daughter Ingebjorg in marriage to Duke Eirik, and his niece, the daughter of King Eirik Magnusson, to Duke Valdemar. The marriage of the two princesses was celebrated at Oslo, September 29, 1312. But King Euphemia did not live to see this happy consummation of her fondly cherished hopes, as she died in the month of May the same year. In 1316 a son was born to each of the dukes, and Haakon V could rejoice to see the succession secured in his own family, as Ingebjorg's son, Magnus Eriksson, now became heir apparent to the throne. But before long his joy was again turned to grief. The restored King Birger of Sweden, who had not forgotten the ignominy heaped upon him by his brothers, the Dukes Eirik and Valdemar, invited them to a feast of reconciliation at the castle of Nykoping, where he seized them and threw them into a dungeon, where they perished. The manner of their death is unknown, but the rumor spread that they were starved to death, as no marks of violence were seen on their bodies. The shock of this quite unexpected tragedy seems to have shortened King Haakon's life. He died May 8, 1319, 49 years of age. Norway still appeared to be as strong and prosperous as ever heretofore. The hereditary principle, which had been so firmly adhered to, gave the throne great stability and contributed to the centralization of government in the hands of the king, whereby an efficiency in administration and a public order were secured which Norway and Sweden, torn by internal strife, might well have coveted. The Norwegian fleet was still the strongest in the north, and the colonies were firmly united with the kingdoms, but unmistakable signs of decadence, like the creeping shadows of approaching darkness, heralded the passing of Norway's national glory. The growing influence of the Hanseatic merchants, the shrinkage in Norwegian shipping and commerce, and the unhappy change of foreign policy were not more ominous signs than the decay of the national literature during the first part of the 14th century. In King Haakon's reign a considerable literary activity was still maintained. Haakon V, no less than his queen Euphemia, showed great interest in literature, and stimulated greatly the writing of chivalric romances. He took great delight in good stories, and caused many romances to be translated from French or Greek to Norwegian. This branch of the Old Norse literature had flourished, especially in Norway, while the historic literature was almost exclusively Icelandic. Through the Viking expeditions, and still more through a lively commercial intercourse, the Norsemen came in direct contact with intellectual life in the British Isles and northern France. In earlier days their skaldic poesy showed marked traces of Irish influence, and we find the same causes still operating later when they produced their great literature of prose romances under the influence of French and English poems of chivalry. When the saga literature produced in Norway is romance and not history, it only proves what intimate relations the Norsemen maintained with their neighbors across the sea. In many respects the romantic sagas written in Norway bring evidence of no less originality and literary talent than the histories written by the Icelanders, for although the themes and plots of these stories are of foreign origin, many of the romantic sagas are admirably written, and show many of the best features of the sagaman's art. King Sverre and his successors were well educated. They were thoroughly in sympathy with the cultural life of Western Europe, and found great delight in reading these chivalric and romantic tales, as well as the history of their own country and the lives of the saints. We have seen how they encouraged the writing of history, which is a sufficient proof that they fully appreciated the value of this branch of the old literature, but they also encouraged the writing of romantic sagas for diversion and entertainment. The writing of romances is therefore a part of the original and creative literary activity which produced the great Old Norse literature, and when Haakon V took great delight in good stories, and caused many romances to be translated from the French or Greek to Norwegian, he only continued the literary activity of his illustrious ancestors. But a notable change had nevertheless come. The saga style had ceased to be a suitable vehicle for the thoughts and sentiments engendered in an age of chivalry. Adapted to this purpose, it rapidly degenerated, and the romances were becoming verbose and formless nonsense. Before the middle of the century, literary productivity ceased, and as the classic saga literature became foreign to the changed spirit of the age, it was no longer read and was gradually forgotten. At the same time, a new literature was springing up among the common people, fostered by impulses received from Germany and Denmark. This new literature of tales, ballads, and folk songs, half epic and half lyric, afforded new opportunity for a suitable expression of the thoughts and feelings of the age. Norway's first great literary period was closed. The shrill blasts of the war trumpets died away, and the martial notes of the skaldic poetry changed into cooing love songs and plaintive ballads. The manly vigor which had raised the Norsemen to power and prominence was ebbing, and growing decay had fallen upon national life like an evil destiny. But the old forms of culture passed, only to germinate after a period of rest into more perfect growth. It is the ebb and flow of human life, both alike necessary to its constant rejuvenation and its permanent progress. End of chapter 74. End of History of the Norwegian People, Volume 1 by Knut Gjerset. This book has been read for you by Eirik Bjørnsson. I'll see you next time.